Please welcome Technical Director Sean Tracy and Senior Tools Programmer Andreas Rohr.
Thank you.
Well, great. Thanks a lot for coming, guys. Star Citizen, CitizenCon 2948. So I've been doing these for a few years, so it's pretty fun. And I'm super happy that you guys came to our talk, because who cares about spaceships in a space game, right?
Exactly.
Let's hear about content and physics and cloth simulations and all those manners of things. So before we get too far, I just want to introduce myself and Andreas. For those that don't know me, I'm Sean Tracy, the Technical Director of Content at Cloud Imperium Games. And with me on stage today is Andreas Rohr. He's one of our senior tools programmers out of Frankfurt. So thanks a lot for flying all the way out from Frankfurt. He works very close with our engine guys on a lot of the stuff that we're going to show you today. So really happy to have him here with us today. All right, so let's dive right in. Now, this is a bit of an introduction. I want to talk about what we're actually going to do here. So environments and even characters in some cases within Star Citizen have arguably been a bit static, and recently the physics, engine, and game teams have been making a really concerted effort into helping bring some life into basically all our scenes and with our content using physics on our assets. So this talk is going to cover some of the work that they've been doing and some of the features that Art and Design are now able to start using within Star Citizen and Squadron 42. So before I get too far, I really want to give a big shout out to the guys that have actually done this work and allowed us to kind of represent it and show you guys today, because this is super early stuff. We've only been kind of having this online in the last, let's say, month and a half, 2 months or so. So I'm really happy for guys like Chris Rain and the physics gurus over in Frankfurt to kind of let us show you this in a very early state. They were quite nervous, obviously, about that. I'm a little crazier. I want to show you guys all this stuff all the time. But of course, this is really important that I give them a really nice shout out. And we're really lucky to be able to kind of stand up here and represent those guys. Okay, so let's actually talk about what we're going to talk about. The talk is split into two sections. First, we're going to talk about environments. And this is going to include things like planet wind. We're going to talk about the wind entity, which is something new for us. We're going to talk about kind of an animated asset or content versus a simulated asset. So doing physics to move it around, or basically having some sort of pre-canned animation. Then we're going to talk about environment cloth itself. So this is our entity cloth, we call it. Then after that, I'm going to pass it over to Andreas, and he's going to talk about character cloth. Now, this is unified now with our environment tech, and this wasn't the case up until now. Then we're going to show you a bit of a demonstration with the implementation that we use right now, because obviously you do have cloth on characters and stuff in the game already. But it's a pendulum simulation versus a vertex simulation. Just show you guys the differences between the two. We'll show you a bit of the actual workflow that we're using and that he's still developing right now, so that the artist can work on this a little bit faster. And then we'll show you a little demonstration of a multi-layered cloth. So this is the thing that we couldn't really achieve before, this kind of content. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the physics of the future, I guess. Yeah, that's a nice one. We'll sell that one. All right. So why do we want to simulate things physically? Now, using physics simulation at runtimes in games is often preferable to using sort of pre-baked animations, especially when placed in dynamic environments. So what do I mean by a dynamic environment? Dynamic weather and wind, it needs to kind of support things like weather effects. You need to be able to do player collision. You need to be able to react to explosions that are nearby. You need to be able to react to AI collisions. All kinds of things that will change around it. So you can't just pre-can an animation asset and do that. You'd rather simulate that physically, but there's problems with that. Obviously comes performance implications and things like this, so we had to solve all of these. So generally when activity is going on near the objects, it should be reacting appropriately. The other thing to why to use these physics is actually content creation itself becomes way, way easier. When we have to make an asset that's just simply animated, it actually goes through a lot of teams. So it goes from design to art to rigging to animation, back to design, and finally in the game. That's a lot of people to go through, and especially when you're in an international corporation and that's got to go through time zones, that takes a while. Instead of just having a designer take an asset and it's ready to go. So what has been the state of simulating such assets for us up until now? Well, it's been really expensive, as I mentioned, in terms of performance, and generally relied on Lua. Now, if you've been keeping track of our object container streaming work, you'll know that we had to remove Lua completely from the engine. This was a huge deal to do. And what that meant was things that were previously working before didn't work at all anymore. So, it's not that this isn't revolutionary by any stretch, but we did have access to similar things, but there were big assumptions that those older entities were making. And the biggest assumptions of the pre-existing entities were things like assuming Z up, like Z is always going to be up, or Z, I'm sorry, I'm Canadian. And ultimately, they hadn't changed much since earlier versions of the engine, so they just weren't suitable at our scale, nor for the performance implications that we have. So we'd already tried a few techniques previously, but they've either proved too expensive, and I'm sure you've seen them within demos, tarps floating in the wind, flags, and things like this. They were either too expensive to run on a planet, or the tools and entities just didn't work anymore. So generally, we didn't really have a planet-side location that needed a lot of this, so it wasn't as big of a deal, but now with Hurston, as you've seen, there's wind, there's atmosphere, there's lots of stuff going on near these objects, so it's very important that we brought this online. So, and again, thanks to our amazing work by our physics gurus back in Frankfurt, new implementations are now usable by art and design for things like constraints, soft bodies, environment cloth, and last but not least, character cloth. All right, so we'll keep going. So, as you saw already in the demo, we have wind on planets. So even tweakable to each of the planets and even to each of the ecosystems, which is really cool. So this was created by our planet technology team. This helps give tons more movement and life to otherwise a really static environment. If you saw those trees just sitting there, not moving at all, it would take you back to the early 2000s, even early 90s of games where the stuff just didn't move around. As mentioned previously, this whole wind system, it did exist, and we had wind for levels. But again, this needed to be rewritten to work in a non-flat 2D world, basically. This is actually, convolved around a sphere. So the wind, in the end, has to be relative to this a spherical position on the planet. So you can imagine how that's actually a little bit difficult. So changes were mostly related to making that work in 3D on a sphere. So the second type of wind, well, I'm sorry, let me show you a quick video here. So this is the savanna biome that you saw a little bit of. I'm actually right in front of the crashed satellite in this particular video. And I just wanted to do a quick pan because you see how much life already that brings. So you see leaves moving in the wind. You see it affecting the particles. You see it affecting the grass. And again, this is the wind flowing through. This just happens. So now, again, this is set on a per biome level, but even at a per biome level, that scale is pretty gigantic. So now, on a much more isolated level, we have a new type of wind that all mixes in within the planet wind. It's supported, it's called the wind area entity. So this is what you see an image of here and here. So the wind area itself physically simulates the air, with a given resistance, viscosity, and it moves in a user-defined direction at a user-defined speed. And users, meaning the designers, basically. They can select this entity and set all of these things really, really quickly. So generally, if no direction is set, the wind source moves omnidirectionally, and that's what you see on this image here. It's actually a sphere of wind. So this is all emanating from a single point outwards. And then if you give it a direction, you can see that we have these nice little debug arrows, and that's going to actually give it a very specific direction that it is. So this gives the designers the ability to actually localize their wind a lot more realistically. The other thing we do with these is we like to attach them to things. Those things like the back of a ship, for example, if you got thrusters and things like that. So both of these eventually need to work into the weather system that Chris Roberts is obviously very keen for us to start working on, but these are the stepping stones into something like this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about an animated cloth versus this new extended cloth entity. So sometimes animation is suitable to do, especially if the player's not going to be near it or nobody's going to really affect it. But again, it kind of has to go through a lot of people. So it's not that great because it's not affected by dynamics in the end. So let me show you a quick example of that going on. So on the left, we have a pre-baked one. Now, all these little gizmos you see there are actually joints. So there's 30, 40 joints moving this around. Now, these two tarps are actually placed on boxes. I've removed the boxes, obviously. So it takes a certain amount of markup to still get our entity cloth reacting to this. I've also got now a wind entity that we just talked about, and I'm going to move it over the dynamic one. Did the video pause? Why did the video pause? I'm sorry, I got excited and I clicked on it. So you see, as it moves around, that actually reacts very realistically to it. And again, it's marked up as if it's on boxes, and we do this just with vertex colors. So we can make an asset, we can mark it up, and as you see, when I move the wind entity over the animated object, nothing happens, right? Because this is just a pre-canned animation doing the same thing, and this will collide with players, this will move into any of the wind direction changes, and as you see, I'm just pulling it all over it. So if any explosion happens, if anything dynamic happens, it's going to react appropriately. So that sort of gives you a good example of, there we go, sorry. A good example of why sometimes you want to make this dynamic rather than pre-canned sort of animation. And again, it saves on our joints, saves on animation, saves on a lot of work. So let's show a couple of the features of this extended cloth entity. So this is kind of a fun thing. Now, our physics guru, Chris Rain, really wanted us to do this really nice sort of ship reveal with a nice satin cloth and everything, but we had a lot of work to do for this demo and some other stuff later on. So it's close. It's close to what he wanted. I hope he's happy with it. So the physics team, similar to the RIN, had to rewrite this cloth entity implementation completely from scratch. It was really important because we had some trouble with earlier versions, and it's not only that it didn't work at the scale of planets and assumed things like Z up, but there was other problems with the earlier implementations within the engine anyways. And most of these problems related to instabilities within the simulation, and what that would cause is something called, we kind of call it poly soup. It's like a big ball of polygons that just can't recover from the simulation. So you can't ship a game with that kind of stuff. If we shipped it out to you and you had an interaction like that, I mean, that's not acceptable to us, so we had to change that. So major culprits of poly soup are usually the topology of the asset itself, and without going too deep into it, the geometry being simulated has to be really regular faces, or the face areas have to be the same. Otherwise, you'd end up with this sort of poly soup ball. Ultimately, the issue was that the topology of the render mesh and the simulation itself were coupled. So basically, whatever your render mesh topology was, that was how it was going to simulate. We've decoupled that now. Lastly, we didn't have self-collision before, so cloth couldn't collide with itself. That's an important component because it means you can have freely flowing cloth, meaning not attached to anything. You've probably seen it in a million games. They have, a tapestry up on the wall or just something hanging from something. And very seldom do you ever see free-flowing cloth just moving around soft body in the world. So let's get this video going because I'm already going over time. Sorry. All right, so I've got a quick video. I just threw an M50 down on Daymar, and I got a couple deck crew taking care of it. I was getting lonely. So you see, I spawn up this cloth, and it keeps pausing. Sorry about that. I spawn the cloth in, and I just turn on our AI physics, and basically physics starts simulating, and that drapes over the ship just as you would expect it to. So now I keep playing around with it a little bit, and there's so many different properties actually exposed directly to the designers for something like that. So I need to mention that this is a hyper-efficient simulation, and there's a certain amount of, it's a user-defined variable for friction. Right, so we can pull the ship out, and I can change the friction so that that thing will slide right off, or it will kind of hold on to it. But now I'm going to do something a little more extreme, and this is where you really need the self-collision. Keep pausing. So there you can see it fold up upon itself, and we're going to run it again just to show you again. It never gets to a state that it can't recover in terms of the simulation, and it's always going. It's a purely deterministic simulation, regardless of the frame rate and time step size, which is a big deal for us. It's also unconditionally stable, so it's never going to explode and will fully recover. So when I mentioned those wind entities before and sort of attaching to the back of the ships, and I was just wiggling it around under it just to show you how dynamic that stuff actually is. So let's say you had, I don't know, a little flag on the ship, or you might have a Superman ship with a cape on it, who knows. Why do these videos keep pausing? So I dropped it on the back, and I've got a little wind entity actually attached to the back, so let's turn on the ship.
Yeah.
And it blows off onto these poor guys back there. So we'll do that one more time because, I don't know, they need it. So now you can see their heads poking through. That was my fault, actually, on the topology of the asset itself. It just needed to be a little bit tighter for collision. And you can see that that wind is still going on and it flutters down onto them quite nicely. So I'm going a little bit over time, so I'm not going to go over too deep of the other things. But again, this is early times. You guys are going to see tons of this now within the environments. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Andreas, who I sucked up 2 minutes of your time. I am so sorry.
Well, hopefully that's not going to be a problem. Thanks, Sean. All right, so I'm going to talk about character cloth. As Sean has told you, the solver had been rewritten completely from scratch. Previously, we've had two different pipelines, two different solvers, and that's always like a pain in the... It's a big pain to maintain these two things. It needs like separate teams to do that, and like, yeah. So the unification is really a big deal for us. And let me tell you a little bit more about how the previous system worked that Sean has mentioned, this so-called pendulum simulation. So imagine like the characters, all our characters in the game, they have this internal skeleton, which is made up of joints or bones, as they're called. And these pendulums are essentially extensions of these skeletons. So they were used primarily to attach more kind of rigid, like simple objects, like for instance grenades, attach them to a body, or like a rocket launcher at the back of your back. And whenever you moved, this stuff like wiggled slightly around. And it wasn't originally not really supposed to be used for more complex, simulating more complex types of objects, such as cloth, shirts, capes, trench coats, whatever. So what they did was, like in earlier titles that used the system, they created ropes of these basically joined chains and created several of them and connected them together so they would form something like a sheet of cloth. But the real resolution of these things was always very, very coarse, so it always lacked in terms of like fidelity. And now with this vertex cloth approach, you have the ability to put a lot more detail into these meshes, and that results in much better looking simulations. So as you can see here, which side is which? So vertex cloth, the new stuff is on the left, and you can see all these wrinkles going on, creases, folds forming dynamically, reacting to the animation of the player. The thing is, like in general, like in terms of character cloth, the problem with character cloth is that characters are much more dynamic than environments. So even though with a new cloth, our environment cloth can be more dynamic and can move about in the environment theoretically, primarily it will be curtains or tarps, flags, this kind of stuff. A cloth on a character needs to undergo much more stress because who knows what the player ends up doing with the character. They jump out of their ship and expect to land somewhere and their cloth still looking nice and neat. So for the physics solver, that's very demanding. So we're quite happy that this new solver is very stable. It doesn't explode. Sometimes, like for more extreme cases, you need to help the solver a little bit. And that's why we have these markup tools for. So I worked in the film industry on cloth simulation and soft body simulation for a number of years. And in the film industry, there is this, the industry standard there is digital content creation package called Maya, and that inside has a solver that's called NCloth. And wait a second, yeah, so let me just, yeah. So this particular solver is kind of the industry standard. It's quite robust. It's easy to author. So my idea was, instead of creating new authoring tools within our sandbox editor, which is a significant amount of work to do that, let's just use Maya because, for instance, all our character rigs are already authored in Maya. The character animations are authored there. All the character assets are put together in Maya and then exported. It paused again. So that's why it made all kinds of sense to also do the cloth setup authoring there. And what you can see here is, let me scrub through real quick. By painting these, what we call vertex attributes, you can define, for instance, how far the cloth is attached to the rigidly deforming mesh. And by doing that, you can kind of guide the simulation in places where, it's going to be like, there could be problems when it gets pushed between collision objects, for instance, and then, even the most stable simulation could run into problems. It has its own will for some reason. Yeah. So in this case, I authored it in a way so that the attributes that you can use are exactly like a mirror of this encloth tool that you can have in Maya. And the reason for that is that artists can already use a tool that they are familiar with. They can author it in exactly the same way. Even the words, the descriptions of the attributes are the same. And that way, I think they can be much more productive. So the main problem with the previous system, is that the mouse? No, was that the authoring part was very cumbersome and very limiting. And through this system, we're going to be able to create the most complex of setups that I think you'll have seen in games. Sean has already shown, or we've already seen the example of the trench coat on Bishop. But the real deal is like this, what we call layered cloth, where you have like separate different layers of cloth interacting with each other. And so that's what I'm going to show you next. So this is probably the worst case example of what you can have. So here, that's some. That's not the final product, but
we do it on purpose.
Yes, I think when you're a physics programmer and you've been working on your code for so long, the first moment you see stuff like that, it's like you're super happy because that's already a big breakthrough. We've color-coded these individual sheets so we can see where they interpenetrate if they do, but it's already pretty clean, and that was one of the first tests we did. So Chris Rain has clearly done a tremendous job there.
So Hurston Security.
Yeah, so. Yes, so that is one of the Hurston security guards, I think, and it's just amazing how complex this stuff is, and it still looks like impeccable. It looks similar to like an offline cloth simulation. And ultimately, with this system, what I'd like to do is simulate as many objects as we can. Like currently, most of these more dangling, free-hanging cloth things are simulated, but there are other things even if you have trousers that aren't super tight, even if those have a tiny amount of degree of freedom to move, then your entire animation will look more dynamic and more believable. And if we end up doing this on the entire body, I think we'll have really amazing-looking characters in the future. Right. So talking about future, Sean is going to give you a bit of an overview of what's coming up next.
Sure. I'll just let that one play out here. I was manually looping that last bit there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This was some great work, literally in the last week, from some super good tech artists, Gage Hallman, Marcy Lee, Chris and Forrest, as well as the physics programmers helping them out. So Chris Rain and the physics team there. So big props to them for doing this.
There was no clipping in that at all.
That was the idea. So the comment was no clipping, definitely. And that's the whole idea of it, that there's self-collision, that we can do that layered cloth, and it's not necessarily something that we could do with pendulum cloth before. So it's going to let us kind of do the Queen Amidala cape, dragging on the ground, going down the stairs, and these kind of things is going to be pretty awesome. So some of the future stuff that the physics guys are okay with us kind of mentioning a little bit is something called deformables. This might be something where this is all R&D and kind of, hopefully we can do this. But this was something we tried out in one of the early games on an earlier implementation of the engine. Deformables is something that will react to an explosion force. The easiest way that I've ever had to explain it is imagine it simulating like a cloth for a single frame. So that once something deforms and it holds rigids. So we could deform things like sides of the ships, sides of buildings, doors, train containers, whatever you can think of. So train containers, sea containers. Yeah, there's trains in Hurston, we're good. Further performance improvements, it's already orders of magnitude faster than what we had before. So this is going to be very, very accomplishable within the game, and you guys will see it quite soon. Tessellation, so even getting further to basically density on those assets that you see. Something we mentioned a little bit called signed distance fields. That's something I was hoping we could talk about today. Not quite ready to talk about it. This is something we're going to do to massively optimize collisions and to do some work basically with effects like shields and things to just make them conform a little bit more to the ships. It's going to be quite nice. Tearing, so imagine that cloth being able to tear. Maybe shoot some holes in it. That'll be quite cool. And then even better, and this is something that's online, not quite ready to show it, but our soft bodies, and soft body's not just a cloth, soft body's something that has volume but is squishy. So like a pillow or like a duvet or something like this. So then on top of that, we want soft body to soft body collisions, of course, so that'll be quite cool. And many more things that I'm sure are sitting in their brain that will come up. Yeah, of course. So with that, we want to give some big special thanks in alphabetical order. So that to Ali Brown, Director of Graphics Programming, Chris Rain, as I've mentioned, senior, I'm actually not sure what his title is, physics guru, that's fine. Math wizard. Gage Hallman, tech artist on the cloth. Forrest Steffen helped with the captures. Ivo Herzeg, implemented that pendulum simulation that we are sitting there talking crap about. Jens Lind, gameplay engineer. Milan Paycheck helped us all with the management of this presentation. Marcy Lee, one of the tech artists doing the work on the asset. Rob Dixon, a tech artist in the UK, also working on the asset. And then Thomas McCallick. I'm probably saying that wrong. That did the help. So big special thanks to those guys for helping us do this talk, basically, under pressure, definitely. So thanks for the time, guys. Really appreciate you coming.
Like and share if you enjoy the video and think others might benefit from this. And of course, subscribe and hit the notification button if you are new to the channel and want to be notified every time I post a video.